should be two-way. It should be open with First Nations. That's the approach we advocate, and that is why we oppose this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes debate for now. The member for Chambly-Borduas will have 5 minutes for questions and comments when we resume debate. Statements by members.
Members, the honourable member for Vegreville, Wainwright.
Mr. Speaker, the most important issues I have dealt with in my 22 years as a Member of Parliament are pro-life issues. These are issues dealing with abortion and end of life, such as physician-assisted suicide. They have been the most important, but also the most difficult and sometimes frustrating to deal with. Often it seems that progress is too slow, but on the other hand, we do need to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that progress is being made. On May 14th, the annual pro-life rally was held here on Parliament Hill. The turnout was very encouraging, with a huge crowd of more than 25,000 people, the largest on record. As usual, the approach was extremely positive, with a focus on helping young women and men who are struggling with the decision to possibly abort their unborn child, to find the support they need to decide to have the child. Barring serious health concerns, this is always the right decision. Information and help are offered to parents to decide what to do after that. Progress is being made, and pro-lifers here and across Canada, Mr. Speaker, should be proud and thankful for this.
Statements by members. Déclaration. The honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the historic steps taken by Parliament and by the Government of Canada in addressing the suffering caused to mothers, children and families by the drug thalidomide.
For survivors and their families, this is a day they've waited far too long for.
The survivors and their families waited more than 50 years for the Canadian government to acknowledge the hardships they endured as a result of using a drug approved by our government. But finally, Mr. Speaker, on December 1st of last year, parliamentarians united to urge the government to provide the survivors with the support they need to live out their lives with dignity and respect.
I wanted to thank all members for joining forces to remedy this injustice, and to thank the Minister for the work, for putting in place a program for survivors that will provide assistance.
Democratic Party, I want to thank the survivors and their family and the organizations they worked with, the Thalidomide Victims Association and the Task Force for their tireless efforts, in particular to pay tribute to Mercedes Benegbi, who is as graceful as she is tenacious. It was a true honor to get to know Mercedes and work with her for these past few months. In closing, it has been said many times that no amount of financial support can ever undo what happened. But it is our hope that going forward, you are able to live the rest of your lives with dignity and respect.
Statements by members. The honourable member for McLeod.
Mr. Speaker, I stand today to recognize three people from my riding of McLeod who have been honoured for their incredible achievements in sport. Chris Koch of Nanton and Jim Bearcat Murray of Okotoks will be inducted into the Alberta Sports Hall of Fame on Friday. Meanwhile, Olympian Jason Parker of Millerville was inducted into the Saskatchewan Sports Hall of Fame earlier this month. Born without limbs, Chris has lived by the motto, "Be more afraid of regret than failure," and he has little to regret. A renowned motivational speaker, Chris golfs, snowboards, and of course, most importantly, he works his family farm in Nanton. Bearcat Murray, the iconic former trainer of the Calgary Flames, was inducted into the National Hockey League Hall of Fame in 2009 and described being named to the Okotoks Hall of Fame as the most heartwarming honor ever, even more so than the 1989 Stanley Cup. I would like to congratulate these outstanding Albertans, these outstanding Canadians, a Foothills Municipal Councillor, a determined farmer from Nanton, and even a bald little potlicker from Okotoks for all that they have achieved and an inspiration to us all. Thank you.
The honourable member for Westmount Ville-Marie.
Mariam Shafipour is a 28-year-old Iranian student who was sentenced to 7 years in prison by the Iranian regime in 2014 for daring to promote change from within. Mariam Shafipour's case is emblematic of thousands who have fallen victim to the Iranian state's brutality. More people than ever have been executed since President Rouhani took over. The regime is particularly harsh on female students. It monitors for proper behavior and dress. Violations can result in expulsions and even beatings. Since being imprisoned, the Iranian regime has refused the Shafipour's family's repeated requests for her transfer to a hospital to seek treatment for heart, stomach, and dental problems that she developed in prison. The Iranian authorities should know that the world is watching how it treats Mariam Shafipour. That treatment makes a cruel joke of their claim to be a defender of the oppressed.
The member for Langley.
Mr. Speaker, our government is providing strong leadership in the global effort to end preventable deaths of mothers, newborns, and young children. I am pleased to report to the House that thanks to our Prime Minister's principled leadership, partnering with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, maternal mortality rates in developing countries are declining and millions more children are celebrating their 5th birthday. I also want to thank Senator Asha Seth, who has worked tirelessly to establish the International Maternal, Newborn and Child Health Week. This week will provide an annual opportunity for Canadians, private partners and governments to focus on promoting the health and well-being of mothers and children around the world. I invite all members in this House to attend tomorrow's reception in room 256 South from 5:30 to 7:30 to celebrate our government's initiative that is saving lives. Thank you.
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Mr. Speaker, in my first statement to this House almost 4 years ago, I pointed out how privileged the Conservative members opposite are to sit across from such raw and rugged beauty. Of course, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking of the stained glass window above me and to the left of the pitcher plant, official flower of Newfoundland and Labrador. I told Conservative MPs to look to the pitcher plant when they spoke of my province. They faced the pitcher plant, Mr. Speaker, when they closed the Veterans Affairs Office in Corner Brook, when they failed Labrador's Burton Winters, when they defended the actions of a minister in using a search and rescue helicopter as a taxi, when they refused to revisit policies that threaten our rural communities and break promises in trade deals, and most recently, Mr. Speaker, when they deviate from policy at the expense of Newfoundland and Labrador fishermen. 4 years ago, I stood in this place, Mr. Speaker, and warned Conservative MPs that the pitcher plant is carnivorous and devours its prey whole. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to standing in this House on the government side after the next election and showing the pitcher plant the respect it deserves.
Bravo! The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, the year 2015 marks the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Dental Corps. Since the formation of the Canadian Army Dental Corps on May 13, 1915, Canada's military dental services have served overseas in both World Wars, Korea and Afghanistan, and many other peacemaking and peacekeeping humanitarian and forensic operations. They've cared for the oral health needs of Canada's troops, both at home and abroad. As a dentist myself, and on behalf of all members of this House, I would like to thank these brave men and women for their service, and I wish them all the best as they embark on the next 100 years of providing a very important service, helping to ensure optimum health of our men and women in uniform. Thank you, Mr.
Well done.
The honourable member for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last weekend I had the opportunity to attend 3 ceremonial review programs for the cadet program in Cumberland, Colchester, and Musquodoboit Valley. And I can't tell you how impressed I was at the level of discipline and decorum displayed by these young ladies and gentlemen. Now, I was particularly proud that both the Toronto Navy League cadets and RCSCC 88C cadets were both recognized as the most improved cadet corps in Nova Scotia. Congratulations to them all. Well done. Now, cadets invite all youth from ages 12 to 18. The program focuses on citizenship, on leadership, and on fitness. Now, cadets, of course, are proud citizens of Canada. They are healthy in mind and healthy in body, and they are the leaders of tomorrow. But what is more important is when they engage in cadets, they have a lot of fun, Mr. Speaker. Cadets is one of the few remaining youth activities in this country that people can participate in, young people can participate in, free of charge. To all the staff, parents, and others involved cadets, thank you very much.
The honourable member for York South Weston.
Mr. Speaker, a glimpse into the successes and struggles in my riding of York South Weston. Hammerheads is an apprenticeship training program paid for by unions and operated by the Central Ontario Building Trades in my community. Over the past 5 years, Hammerheads has launched a career for 194 young adults, focusing on disadvantaged and First Nations youth. It has saved over $1 million in welfare costs alone. It's so successful that 20 of these young adults have been able to buy their own homes. It's a remarkable example of a homegrown solution, but it is only 194 people. Meanwhile, George Harvey High School in York South Weston has run a breakfast program for 12 years, feeding children who would otherwise not get to eat. Over 150,000 breakfasts have been served. Program sponsors estimate that in my riding, 38% of children go to school hungry each day. On my visit there this morning, I met the volunteers like Vince and Imad and his family who do this to help kids be able to learn. While the success of the Hammerheads program is something to celebrate, the grip of poverty in my riding shows we have much more work to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, the Universal Child Care Benefit and Family Tax Cut will benefit all families with children in my riding of Etobicoke Lakeshore and across Canada. Last week, I met with hundreds of constituents who are grateful for our government's track record of helping families make ends meet. They know they have a government that respects taxpayers and their hard-earned tax dollars. Unlike the Liberal leader who wants to take all of this away, our government wants to keep taxes low and focus on economic growth. We want to make sure that all Canadians benefit and save for their priorities. Mr. Speaker, it was the Liberal leader himself who said that, quote, benefiting every single family isn't what is fair. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work hard for all Canadians so that they can keep more of their money in their pockets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, over 50% of workers in Toronto can't access full-time employment. That's work that comes with a pension, benefits, or job security. Even those who thought they were full-time employees today can wake up tomorrow to find they've been reclassified as independent contractors. So on behalf of all the temp workers in my riding, all of you in Davenport not knowing whether your short-term contract will be renewed, to the freelancers and self-employed I meet at the Common, to all of you holding down multiple part-time jobs and squeezing into a packed Dufferin bus to pick up your kids from expensive childcare, to new Canadians and you young workers from Queen Street to Eglinton working for free as unpaid interns, I want to thank United Way Toronto and researchers at McMaster University for their incredibly important report tabled last week on the outrageous growth of precarious work in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Mr. Speaker, we must bring Canada's labour laws and policies into the 21st century to reflect the reality of work today. Thank you.
Member for Brandon Stewart.
Last week, Canadian farmers, supported by our Conservative government, celebrated a great victory over American protectionism when the World Trade Organization ruled against the United States' mandatory country of origin labeling policy. This is the fourth time the WTO has ruled in Canada's favour and denounced this protectionist policy that has been costing our meat industry billions of dollars on an annual basis. Let me be clear that this decision is final. There are no further appeals for the Obama administration. Canada's allies in the U.S. Congress have begun to take steps towards repealing COOL. However, until this policy is reversed, our government will be seeking authority from the WTO to impose retaliatory measures against U.S. exports. Mr. Speaker, unlike the opposition parties, which have been mute on this issue of COOL for years now, our Conservative government continues to stand on the side of Canadian farmers and ranchers, and we will continue to protect all hard-working Canadians throughout the retaliatory process.
The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Over the past 5 decades, untold numbers of Canadian women and children have endured terrible and debilitating long-term effects from the morning sickness drug thalidomide. The irresponsible distribution of this drug during the late 1950s and early 1960s and the subsequent mistreatment of those who suffered its terrible side effects is a shameful chapter in Canadian history. This is an injustice that has spanned many decades and many governments of all political stripes. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the government for finally coming forward with an appropriate compensation package for the 92 surviving thalidomide victims in Canada. We welcome Mercedes and a number of victims to Parliament Hill today, and I know all parliamentarians pay tribute to their courage and tenacity in the pursuit of this belated justice. This compensation, while long overdue, will allow victims to live with dignity and ensure that their medical needs are met. We would also like to pay tribute to journalist Ingrid Peretz, who ensured victims' stories were heard and that their plight could no longer be ignored.
You're here. The honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday CNN reported that ISIS fighters murdered nearly 100 people, including a dozen children. This same death cult has called for attacks in Canada against Canadians. We cannot protect Canada by simply choosing to ignore this threat. On behalf of my riding of Etobicoke Centre, I want to say thank you to the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who are standing up to this threat head-on. In the last week alone, Canadian CF-18 Hornets have struck multiple ISIS fighting positions in both Iraq and Syria. These strikes are part of our continued mission to degrade ISIS until they no longer represent a threat to Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chambly-Bourgeois.
Excitement as thousands of Albertans gathered in front of the Alberta Legislature to cheer on Premier Notley as she was sworn in.
The size of the crowd and its enthusiasm was something to see, and it reminded me of our enthusiasm when we formed the official opposition as the NDP for the first time. And since then, we've worked hard for our fellow citizens to put forth concrete ideas that will make their lives better, like affordable childcare spaces, like reductions in taxes for SMEs, and restoring home delivery mail services. And we defended things even when they weren't popular, like the case of Bill C-51, where we opposed it. In the NDP, we are doing politics differently. Next October, people from across the country will have an opportunity to elect a government that works for them and with them, an NDP government.
Mr. Speaker, we are directing money into the pockets of moms and dads across the country. We have increased the universal child care benefit to almost $2,000 for kids under 6 and $720 for kids 6 through 17. We know the Liberals want to take that money away. That's why they don't want Canadians to know about it in the first place. The Liberal leader said, and I quote, "Benefiting every single family isn't what is fair," end quote. Mr. Speaker, we believe it is fair to benefit every single family and will make sure that families receive those benefits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hey. Oral questions. Questions orales. The honourable member for Halifax.
The Conservative government finally made public its targets for greenhouse gas emissions and for reducing those emissions, but what a disappointment! These are the least ambitious targets of all the G7 countries. The government knows very well that it's not going to be able to meet its new goals or even its former promises. Why is the Conservative government not doing its part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Speaker, our government has announced a fair and ambitious target for Canada that is in line with other major industrialized countries. Unlike the opposition, we want to take a responsible and balanced sector-by-sector approach to reduce emissions that protect the economy and Canadian jobs, and we will do this without forcing a job-killing carbon tax on Canadian families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax.
This climate target is late, and it doesn't deliver Canada's fair share of emissions reductions. And to top it off, the Conservatives want to use questionable accounting and offsets to reach the target, something they used to call, quote, hot air credits. Well, speaking of hot air, Environment Canada says this government has little hope of reaching its old target, and without regulations for the oil and gas sector, Canada won't reach the new target either. So why are the Conservatives setting Canada up to fail in the global fight against climate change?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, we are playing a leadership role at the international stage, and we have helped more than 65 developing countries to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. We're also doing our part by contributing to the Green Climate Fund. We're also the founding member and major financial contributor to the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. We're also addressing short-lived climate pollutants under the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and we'll continue to protect our environment while keeping our economy strong, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax.
Conservatives are learning. According to an RCMP court document, the Prime Minister's office played a, quote, key role in altering and falsifying the 2013 audit of Mike Duffy's expenses. Wow. Other documents show that the Deloitte audit report was changed a total of 7 times to remove criticisms of expense claims, including references to the Ottawa home of Mike Duffy. Does the Prime Minister deny that his office intervened to falsify the findings of the audit into the expenses of Conservative Senator Mike Duffy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you know, as was highlighted, the Prime Minister's office participated and provided a great deal of assistance, turning over thousands of documents and ensuring that we assisted the RCMP and the Crown in its case against Senator Duffy. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this is before the courts, and we'll allow the courts to do their job.
And the honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, sooner or later, even if the Prime Minister wants to avoid giving answers, he's going to have to give answers, Mr. Speaker. Canadians learned from the police that the Prime Minister's office actively helped Senators Tkachuk and Olson alter the report on Mike Duffy's spending. They made changes 7 times. Among other things, they deleted passages that proved that Senator Duffy's residence was indeed in Ottawa. How can the Prime Minister explain that his office is altering such important parts of the Mike Duffy report? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
It's quite clear that the Prime Minister's office provided a great deal of assistance to both the Crown and the RCMP in its case against Senator Duffy, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, I would hope that the opposition would provide that same level of cooperation and assistance to the Canadian taxpayer. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, there's some 68 members of the NDP caucus who owe the Canadian taxpayer some $2.7 million because they paid for some illegal offices in Montreal. I certainly hope they will do the right thing for Canadian taxpayers and assist in returning that $2.7 million to them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Not kangaroo courts. We're talking real courts with real police investigating the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Prime Minister's office had a $90,000 check to keep Duffy quiet on residency issues and doctored an expense audit to avoid political and legal fallout. Now, the Auditor General has sent 10 new cases of improper Senate spending to the RCMP, and 30 more senators will be forced to pay for improper expense claims. 44 cases of apparent abuse of the public trust. That's more than half the Senate, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's office is involved up to their eyeballs. Will the Prime Minister stop defending the unelected, unaccountable, and under investigation Senate?
Invited the Auditor General in, and of course we expect that the Senators will assist the Auditor General in this examination, Mr. Speaker, but there are 68 members of the NDP who owe a total of $2.7 million to the Canadian taxpayer. There's another 23 of them who owe $1.1 million back to the Canadian taxpayer, Mr. Speaker. By my count, that's 3/4 of their caucus. In fact, their leader, the Leader of the Opposition, owes $400,000 to the taxpayer of Canada, Mr. Speaker. It is they who are in front of the courts. It is they who are refusing to cooperate. It's real money. They should do the right thing for the taxpayer and pay it all back.
Honourable member for Bourassa. Mr. Speaker, everyone knows it. The Canadian economy is getting worse and worse. We've come back from a week in our ridings, and, well, one would think that the Conservatives weren't even out there. Canadians, more and more of them are looking for a job. For young people, youth unemployment is up to 15%. Canadians have debt, and they're having a hard time making ends meet. And they don't have $10,000 to put in their TFSAs. Why are the Conservatives opposing the Liberal plan to give back to the middle class and stimulate economic growth? The Honourable Minister of Employment. Mr. Speaker, our economy has already created over 1.2 million net new jobs. 80% are full-time jobs, 80% in the private sector, and 2/3 are in high-paying sectors. But we will continue to train our workers, reduce taxes for employers and for the people who work for them, and we will continue to finalize free trade agreements to create more jobs for all Canadians.
Mr. Speaker, here's the reality of the government's policies. A no-growth economy that's actually been shrinking, poor job creation down 50 or 60% from 2 years ago, big job losses at GM, Bombardier, and across the energy sector, job quality at a 25-year low. The recession, which the Conservatives blame for everything, ended 6 years ago, but there are still 200,000 more jobless Canadians today than before the recession began. Why is this government so unsuccessful on growth, jobs, and fairness?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have exactly one idea for the economy. That is to raise taxes. They want to raise taxes on businesses and raise taxes on Canadian workers. We're taking the opposite approach. Our plan for tax cuts, training, and trade has helped create 1.2 million net new jobs, 80% of them full-time, 2/3 in high-wage sectors. Mr. Speaker, the last thing those hardworking Canadians need is a Liberal tax hike which would hit the middle class, send shockwaves through the economy, and put people out of work.
The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, when the economy is so weak, the risk of worsening inequality becomes more severe. By everyone, from the Parliamentary Budget Officer to the late Jim Flaherty, this government has been warned about disparities getting worse. But still, they're giving a $2,000 tax break to those making $250,000, with no break at all for single moms. They insist on paying benefits to the highest 1% of income earners, and that means the typical middle-class family gets $2,500 less. How is that fair?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Mr. Speaker, just about every fact bullet in the members' talking points is wrong. In fact, the Parliamentary Budget Officer looked at the $30 billion in annual tax relief we provided as of last year and confirmed that the overwhelming majority of benefits went to medium and low-income Canadians. Since that time, we brought forward the family tax cut and benefits, which gives up to $2,000 for families through income splitting, and an additional $2,000 for kids under 6, $720 for kids 6 through 17, Mr. Speaker, money directly in the pockets of parents.
The Honourable Member for La Pointe de l'Île. It's really sad to know that one of the biggest scandals involving the Prime Minister's office is happening just a few feet from right here. Almost half of all senators are under investigation for breach of trust or illegitimate spending. And for the most part, these senators were personally chosen by the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister finally ready to admit that there's a problem in the Senate? Well, Parliamentary Secretary.
She's quite right. Just happening a few feet from here is a big scandal. The scandal is that $2.7 million of taxpayers' money was used illegally to support a partisan NDP office in Montreal. In fact, this member, who is only a few feet away from me, owes close to $30,000 to the taxpayers. See, what the member did was, instead of using money meant for her riding, she funneled it illegally to an office in Montreal that shouldn't have been paid for, and now they're refusing to pay back the taxpayers the $2.7 million they owe. Pay it back.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
More nonsense, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has broken every promise he ever made on Senate reform, and looks where it's got us. The Auditor General's findings will reportedly include Senate trips at didn't appear to involve parliamentary business and indications of widespread spending abuses. 10 new senators potentially under police investigation. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have had enough. The Prime Minister once said an appointed Senate is a relic of the 19th century. Why is he using this relic for partisan fundraising and to kill democratically passed legislation?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Speaker, let's be very clear. Any senator who has broken the law should face the severest of consequences, Mr. Speaker. It is this side of the House that has been fighting for that for 2 years, Mr. Speaker. I contrast that to the opposition, who think it's funny to have used $2.7 million of Canadian taxpayer resources illegally to support partisan offices in Montreal and in parts of the country where they have no members of parliament, Mr. Speaker. That's not funny. Canadians work hard for the money that they earn, and when they send it to us, they expect it to be used wisely, not for partisan purposes like the NDP.
The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Wanda-Fuca.
Mr. Speaker, Conservative cuts are forcing the RCMP to make impossible choices when it comes to protecting public safety. Faced with skyrocketing resource demands of counterterrorism, the RCMP is dismantling Project Condor, their very successful program for finding offenders unlawfully at large. This project recaptured over 600 escaped criminals. We're talking about people convicted of murder, bank robbery, and sexual assault. Why are the Conservatives putting public safety at risk by ending this program that tracks these people down when they escape?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the member knows full well that the RCMP is responsible for their operational choices and priorities, Mr. Speaker. But what the member can do, Mr. Speaker, and his fellow colleague, Mr. Speaker, is stand up in this House for additional funding that was announced by the Prime Minister last week, Mr. Speaker, in Montreal. I invite the member to open his budget at page 325, Mr. Speaker. Then he can invest into RCMP and do like he should have done for 7 times. He's missed it, to support our budget for more resources for RCMP.
The Honourable Member for Esquimalt.
When we look at that page, we find 4 years from now the RCMP will still be below where they were in 2012. The reality is that the Conservatives are all talk when it comes to public safety, and they're hoping Canadians won't notice that the programs and resources that actually keep communities safe are disappearing. What's worse is this government tries to hide its failures. Just take the Defence Minister's comments that funding de-radicalization programs is, quote, unrealistic and could be, quote, counterproductive. Tell that to our allies who are funding these efforts as a front line against terrorism. Why is the minister trying to cover up his government's incompetence instead of acting to counter terrorism?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Here's what the NDP has to say about terrorism in this country, Mr. Speaker. Let me quote the member from Brome-Missisquoi, and I quote, "I am confused about what motivated the government to introduce the Combating Terrorism Act because since 2007, nothing has happened in Canada. The country has not even been subject to terrorist attack. When will the NDP be serious about terrorism in this country? When will they support our initiative?" And Mr. Speaker, we have 4 pillars. The first one is prevention, and we are standing up to protect Canadians in every step of the way.
The Honourable Member for Alfred-Penam. Well, apparently, according to the Minister of Defence, putting federal resources into fighting radicalization would be, quote, counterproductive. And now the RCMP is being forced to cut Project Condor, which allowed us to find dangerous fugitive criminals. And why is the Conservative government ending Project Condor, which was one of the best projects at the RCMP? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I have full confidence in the RCMP to continue to lead its operations and to make strategic choices, Mr. Speaker. And that's why that in the 2015 budget, Mr. Speaker, there are additional resources for the RCMP, for Border Services agents, and for our intelligence services. If my colleague wants to do more, she should vote for our budget to ensure that the RCMP has the necessary resources to protect Canadians. The Honourable Member for Alfred-Penam. The cancellation of Project Condor is not the only example of Conservative government incompetence, Mr. Speaker. We've learned that people accused of sexual assault have been able to cross the border. Even though arrest warrants were out for those people. That's unacceptable. Canadians expect that our borders will be managed in an efficient and safe way by this government. Will the minister act immediately to fix the gaps in our security? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, our government takes border security very seriously, and that is why we have signed an agreement with President Obama and our Prime Minister, the Beyond the Borders initiative. That is also why we have invested in additional resources. Last week, our Prime Minister was at the International Airport in Montreal to announce additional money for Border Services agents, and these measures will increase by 26% the funding for our Border Services agents, and that adds to our major border infrastructure things. And so the best thing they can do to support our borders is to support our budget.
Conservatives have never made up for the massive cuts that they have made to CBSA, cuts that have seriously impacted frontline security. Canadians are right to ask how an individual charged with sexual assault was allowed into Canada despite having an outstanding warrant for his arrest. Our border needs to be efficient and effective at keeping those who pose a threat to public safety out of Canada. What is the minister doing to immediately address a serious deficiency in our border security? Your cuts are not working. What next?
Just remind the honourable member to address his question through the chair and not directly to his colleagues. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for giving me an opportunity to remind that our government has increased the number of border service officers by 26%, Mr. Speaker. In the last budget, there is additional resources to make sure that CBSA is able to tackle with the challenges it faces at the frontier and meet also our requirement to fulfill our engagement and commitment with the Beyond the Border agreement signed between our Prime Minister and President Obama, Mr. Speaker. We are serious when it comes the time to protect our border from criminals, and we will ensure that CBSA is fully complying its mandate by giving them the resources they need. Why is the NDP opposing the budget and supporting our officer, Mr. Speaker?
Honourable member for Davenport.
Well, the question really should be, why is this minister unable to tell the honest truth about cuts to CBSA, Mr. Speaker? The government is also turning away people who are actually legally permanent residents here in Canada. Families are being torn apart simply over an expired ID card. In 2013 alone, well over 5,000 permanent residents were denied travel documents to re-enter Canada. People are losing their permanent residence status because their card expired and they hadn't renewed it yet. When will Conservatives stop their campaign to make life harder and harder for immigrant families in Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, just because the date has expired on a PR card doesn't mean that someone loses their status in Canada. We issue thousands of these new cards every year. But applicants, those permanent residents who qualify, have to put in the application, and they have to meet the requirements of permanent residence, Mr. Speaker. That's 2 years out of 5 inside the country, and they need all the documentation to prove that. Mr. Speaker, we'll continue giving good service to Canadian immigrants, to new Canadian citizens, and to all those visiting our country.
The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Mr. Speaker, the minister's talking about good services, but honestly, I don't know where he's getting that. What he doesn't seem to realize is that the delay for processing these issues are very long. They're much too long. In 2013, 5,000 permanent residents were unable to come into the country. So there's a problem there, Mr. Speaker. And 14,000 others were forced to request temporary travel documents. Does the minister realize that the administrative barriers and the delays in processing these files are a major problem that are penalizing permanent residents? The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. Mr. Speaker, the best way for permanent residents to be able to freely travel is to become Canadian citizens. And that is why we are so proud in this government that 260,000 permanent residents became citizens last year. That's the highest number in the history of Canada, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we offer good services to permanent residents of Canada who stay here 2 years out of 5 and who who meet the requirements of the program. We will continue to do that because we know to what extent Immigration is important for the future of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, this government's performance on trade continues to fall far short of its rhetoric. The most recent example is a breakdown in bilateral negotiations with Japan. Talks have been stalled for months, with Canadian officials citing Japan's focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership as their excuse for the slowdown. But Japan has continued bilateral negotiations with other countries, so this excuse rings hollow. Will this government redouble efforts to schedule a round of negotiations with Japan before we fall behind our foreign competitors, as we did with South Korea, costing Canada billions of dollars and thousands of middle-class jobs?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will not take any lessons when it comes to trade from the Liberals over there. Canada continues to engage with our Japanese partners to advance our trade interests through both bilateral talks and at the TPP. The TPP negotiations are at the advanced stage, with all TPP countries focused on concluding a comprehensive and high-standard agreement as soon as possible. We will continue to negotiate with an eye to concluding the best possible agreement for Canadian businesses, workers, and their families, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre.
Well, a $3 billion trade deficit in March, a historic record, suggests the trade agenda isn't working. And this is not the first time the government has touted an imminent deal without showing any results. As CETA winds its way through EU institutions, it is facing mounting criticism from European officials. There is growing talk that portions of the text may even need to be changed to assuage these concerns, even though Canadians have been told this is a done deal and had hundreds of thousands of their dollars already spent to celebrate it. So will the minister finally forego his Smoke and Mirrors Act and tell us when CETA, which we've already celebrated, will finally be ratified?
Good question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, when they were in government, trade was simply not a priority for the Liberals. During the 13 long years in office, the Liberals signed only 3 trade agreements. Our Conservative government has reached agreements with 38 countries, Mr. Speaker. We are even expanding and improving on the 3 agreements reached under the Liberals in order to maximize the benefits they produce for hardworking Canadians and families. When it comes to creating jobs and economic opportunities through trade, the Liberal Party has proven they can't get the job done, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for West Melville Marie.
Mr. Speaker, not only Japan doesn't want to talk to us about free trade, but clearly the free trade agreement with the European Union that the Prime Minister announced 20 months ago is far from being finalized. As the European Union negotiates with the United States, we've heard that they want to reevaluate and reopen certain clauses of the agreement with Canada, and that nothing is going to be settled before the coming elections. Is this another example where this government promises great things and crows about its economic management, but is unable to deliver the goods? Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, this is the most comprehensive trade agreement that Canada has ever signed. It is expected to create 80,000 new jobs for Canadians and open up market of 500 million new consumers for Canadian businesses, Mr. Speaker. We are confident that EU will bring this agreement into force. The Liberals have been completely absent on the trade file. In fact, when they had to negotiate a free trade agreement, they only got 3 done. We've signed agreements with 38 different countries. We won't take any lessons from the Liberal Party over there, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Dartmouth, Bull Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost 600 municipalities have serious concerns about Canada Post's decision to end door-to-door mail delivery, and residents in my community are upset because they know how difficult the end of home delivery will mean for seniors, for small businesses, people with mobility challenges, and people living in poverty. When will the minister tell Canada Post to go back to the drawing board and start listening to Canadians and communities?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Minister of Transport.
The member will know that in 2014, Canada Post delivered 1.4 billion fewer letters than it did in 2006. He should also know that 2/3 of Canadians currently don't receive door-to-door mail delivery. Canada Post must balance its finances and not be a burden on taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. We expect them to do that.
The honourable member for Terrebonne-Blainville. The upset over Canada Post's decision to end door-to-door delivery continues to grow. Almost 600 municipalities, including Terrebonne, have expressed their discontent. On the weekend, the president of the Union of Quebec Municipalities condemned the attitude of Canada Post and demanded a moratorium. Will the minister finally listen to the public and elected municipal officials and put a stop to this absurd decision? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, in 2014, Canada Post delivered 1.4 billion fewer letters than in 2006. Two-thirds of Canadians' mail is not delivered door-to-door. Delivery has to be done without being a burden on Canadian taxpayers. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, first they changed the name of the museum. It used to be the Museum of Civilization, and now it's the Museum of History. Today we learned that a major exhibit on the history of the union movement is to be axed. The labor movement, according to the Conservatives, that movement contributed to the building of our society. It played a part in creating the middle class, Medicare, and a regular work week. Why does the minister want to erase the contribution made by workers to the history of our country? Thanks again, Mr. Speaker. The member knows full well that our national museums are crown corporations that operate at arm's length. They are responsible for the creation and management of their content. That said, I find it incredibly astonishing that an NDP member would talk about our Museum of History, because when we decided to give them more money to do more work for Canadians, they voted against it. Such hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker.
For Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, if you believe the minister's last answer, I have some real estate you might be interested in. In actual fact, this move has the stink of political interference all over it. First they change the name of the museum, then they change the mandate of the museum, and then they try and sanitize Canadian history to eliminate any reference to things that they don't like. In actual fact, the Winnipeg General Strike was a turning point in the rights of Canadian working people, Mr. Speaker. It's up for its 100th anniversary in 4 short years. Why doesn't the Minister of Heritage butt out of the museum business and let curators curate?
The Honourable Minister of Heritage.
I hate to suggest this, Mr. Speaker, but I think the member's underwear is tight again because he actually voted against additional funding for this museum. And I might add my own 2 cents worth with regards to the Winnipeg General Strike. We're proud of the accomplishments of our past. That's why we're going to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday. And we're going to do it with pride, with dignity, with or without the
Honourable Member from Chatham-Kent.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And unlike the Liberal leader, we think it's fair to help all Canadian families. Yeah. Our efforts are making a difference in communities across the country. Can the Minister for Employment please update this House and Canadians on how we are helping all middle-class families in Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we're doing it by putting money directly into their pockets. I want to thank the opposition and others who brought attention to some videos that I've made to inform Canadian families about the benefits to which they are entitled. Almost $2,000 for kids under 6, $720 for kids 6 through 17. We're looking for 200,000 families. My videos have reached 15,000 of them. Mr. Speaker, we're very excited about the opportunity to reach out to parents, put money directly in their pockets so that they can make the decision as to what's best in how they raise their children.
Member for Longueuil-Pierre Boucher. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Getting back to serious matters. Following Conservative cuts to the CBC, a new study by Quebec and Ontario governments has found that the public broadcaster can no longer fulfill its mandate. The Quebec and Ontario ministers are calling for a boost in funding to the CBC. If we still have a Minister of Canadian Heritage, will she finally listen to the calls from Quebec, Ontario, and the public for renewed investment in the CBC? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've repeatedly said, we are already providing over $1 billion to the CBC every year for them to fulfill their mandate. And we provide adequate funds for them to fulfill their mandate under the law. We recognize the important role that the CBC plays in communities, in minority language communities, and in remote communities, and that is why we fund them to the tune of $1 billion a year. Thank you. Now, a member for Longueuil-Pierre Boucher. The minister keeps boasting about this, but it's only $29 a head per year. So that makes CBC quite a bargain. But the Ontario and Quebec government study shows clearly that in 25 years, Liberals and Conservatives combined have cut the CBC's funding by 50%, Mr. Speaker. Is that what Conservatives use as a reason? Are they not ashamed of that record? The Honourable Minister.
Said by that member is absolutely false. And I might remind the member that it was in the 1990s that the Liberals, when they were in power, cut the CBC by over $400 million. On this side of the room, we are providing over $1 billion a year to the CBC. They are independent of government in their decision-making. And of course, we have seen a change, a drastic change in the media environment to which no broadcaster is immune. They are adjusting and adapting. We'll let them do that.
The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives clearly have a hard time listening to the public. A recent ECOS poll shows that the vast majority of Canadians, even among Conservative supporters, think their Victims of Communism memorial is a very bad idea, especially after they've seen the plans and details for the monument. Why won't the government listen to the public and the City of Ottawa and finally change their wrong-headed plans? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, millions of lives were affected by communism. And so we're erecting this monument to commemorate the families of the victims. But I'd like to quote a few organizations that support us.
This about the location of the monument. By undermining this memorial with shallow, improvised rationalizations that sacrifice principle for insensitive political gamesmanship, you diminish and devalue the victims' contribution to Canada and disrespect their memory. There is misinformation out there spread by the political parties opposite. We will build this monument.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
82% of residents in the National Capital Region and almost two-thirds of Conservative supporters oppose the memorial in its current form. The Minister is ignoring the National Capital Plan, the Mayor of Ottawa, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and local citizens. What kind of government and party ignores the opinion of 82% of the population? Well, I'll give you a hint, Mr. Speaker. The first letter starts with a C. The second letter is an O. You can figure it out from there, I'm sure. Mr. Speaker, why won't this government actually listen to the community and change the location of this monument?
The Honourable Minister of Heritage.
This allows me to provide some information about the misinformation about the location. Of course, it is not going to be constructed in front of the Supreme Court of Canada like the opposition parties are suggesting, but rather on a completely different plot of land further west on Wellington Street. Having said that, we promised in the speech from the throne to honour the 100 million lives lost. We just spent some moments of reflection on the Journey to Freedom Day and the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, with hundreds and hundreds of communities who support the monument and its location. We will build this monument.
Honourable member for Sydney Victoria. Mr. Speaker, spring has arrived in Cape Breton and many communities across Canada. This is when our construction season normally is getting into high gear. But this Conservative government has stalled infrastructure spending last year, and it looks like this year will be another repeat. This past weekend, I was speaking with many councillors in my riding, and they're concerned there's going to be another year lost. Is this Conservative government willing to commit to the Cape Breton Regional Municipality and other municipalities to get the job done and get our people back to work?
Honorable Minister de l'Infrastructure.
Speaker, we have delivered the most important plan of the Canadian history for the infrastructures. We have transferred last year in July and in November to tranches of the gas tax fund to all provinces in Canada. The projects are ready to be announced. Some have been announced in Nova Scotia and other parts of the country. And we will continue to work very hard with municipalities and provinces in respect of jurisdiction, what they don't have done in the past.
The Honourable Member for Trinity Spadina.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's 150th birthday seems to have caught this government by surprise. The Prime Minister has now cobbled together some sort of a scheme to fund community projects to sort of mark the date. Sort of. The deadlines differ from city to city. Some towns have a few days, others a few months, a few weeks to apply. From region to region, the criteria is different. And of course, they have no idea how much any one community can actually apply for because they're making this up as they go along. If anyone is actually in charge of this program, could someone please explain why the process is so complicated, why it's so rushed, why the criteria so flimsy, or will the Prime Minister just admit it's a slush fund for the upcoming campaign?
Order. The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
In addition to our support to the festivities for our 150th anniversary of our country, we will support renovation, expansion, and improvement of existing community infrastructure. In communities across the country, to these new investments, we will support the implementation of projects that celebrate our shared heritage, create jobs, and improve the quality of life of Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Member for Newton North Delta.
Residents in Surrey are worried about their safety and gang violence as it continues to reach crisis levels. It is time for the government to stop stalling. Photo ops and recycled re-announcements won't cut it. Conservatives' re-announcement will have no immediate impact. Our community needs boots on the ground now. Surrey residents are waiting to hear clear timelines from the government about when additional boots will be on the ground. Will the Minister please tell us how soon the new RCMP officers will arrive in Surrey?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud that our Minister of National Revenue was in Surrey last week to stand up and deliver for more safer street community, Mr. Speaker, in Surrey. Mr. Speaker, the government of British Columbia has asked for $200,000 to prevent gang violence. We are coming up with $3.5 million, Mr. Speaker, because we take this issue very seriously, Mr. Speaker. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, we are saying yes. We are standing by the people of Surrey, and I accept the demand and the request of the Minister of Justice of British Columbia to put more boots on the ground. Mr. Speaker, we are standing up, putting more resources, and we will continue to support the people of Surrey.
Yes, resources promised over the next 5 years, not now. People are scared and the community is devastated. They need answers and a clear timeline. The community has been waiting for too long and are tired of empty promises. It is time for a real commitment. Surrey needs help now. Will the Minister give Surrey the answer it's waiting for? When will the RCMP arrive on the ground, on our streets in Surrey?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I agree that the people of Surrey need much more than the lip service of the NDP, Mr. Speaker. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because we adopted tough measures, Mr. Speaker, especially on gang violence, Mr. Speaker. New prison sentences for drive-by shootings, Mr. Speaker. We are putting gang members behind bars. Why? Because we've passed over 30 new tough on crime measures. Where were the NDP, Mr. Speaker? Lip service, no action. We are standing up for the people of Surrey, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Northumberland, Quinte West. Mr. Speaker, the death cult ISIS and the jihadi terrorism pose a real threat to Canada. They've made it clear that they target, by name, Canada and Canadians. Thankfully, Canada is not sitting on the sidelines and is facing this threat head-on. Can the Minister of National Defence update this House on the mission to degrade ISIS?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Speaker, I thank the member for his question and the brilliant work of the Royal Canadian Air Force, much of which is situated in his constituency at CFP Trenton. Mr. Speaker, I can report that since the beginning of our Operation Impact as part of the multinational coalition against this genocidal terrorist organization, that Air Task Force Iraq has conducted 953 sorties, including 620 from our CF-18 Hornet fighters, 160 refueling sorties by our Polaris aerial refuelers, 173 reconnaissance missions done by our CF-140 Aurora modernized aircraft. And Mr. Speaker, thanks in part to the Coalition Air Campaign, ISIS controls 25% less territory than it did last September, but we must continue in the fight, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Soldiers like Master Corporal Colin Fitzgerald, a man decorated for his incredible courage under fire, are returning home only to have to keep fighting, this time with the Conservative government. No. He was medically released with severe PTSD, yet when he applied to Veterans Affairs for benefits he'd earned, VAC re-diagnosed him with simple anxiety, denying him help he needed. This is unacceptable, to be told one thing by National Defence doctors for release and the opposite by Veterans Affairs and denied. When will the Minister compel VAC to accept National Defence doctors' diagnosis?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for that question. As he knows, we are closing the seam with the Canadian Armed Forces to make sure that Veterans Affairs is involved quicker with an injured or ill veteran, Mr. Speaker. We do accept the medical evaluations of the Canadian Armed Forces, Mr. Speaker. And more importantly, we're reducing the stigma, asking men or women to come forward sooner to get the treatment they need, Mr. Speaker. By the end of this year, we will have opened up 26 operational stress injury clinics. Just a couple opened under that government, Mr. Speaker. This is a priority for us, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, thousands of Canadians already can't make their rent payments, and the Conservatives are going to cut funding for 116,000 social housing units by 2018. We're talking about almost 22,000 affordable units in Quebec alone. Thousands of Canadians will see their rent skyrocket. They quite simply can't afford to pay more. What steps is the government prepared to take to protect the existing supply of social housing and to respect everyone's right to housing? The Honourable Minister.
There are no cuts to housing investments. In fact, Mr. Speaker, our government has renewed housing investments, whether it's our investment in affordable housing, $1.25 billion, or our homelessness partnering strategy, which is over $600 million going across the country. Mr. Speaker, we're helping in terms of building houses, we're helping in terms of supporting those who are homeless, and we're helping vulnerable Canadians by giving them benefits like the universal child care benefit and tax cuts, direct benefits that reduce poverty and help those who are vulnerable.
The Honourable Member for Oakville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 50 years ago, thalidomide was prescribed to treat morning sickness in expectant mothers. Tragically, thalidomide caused serious and permanent physical and emotional damage to mothers, infants, and to families. Canada's drug safety system has come a long way since the days when thalidomide was approved, and I've been proud to be part of that change. I was pleased to support the call for full support to be provided to thalidomide survivors, and I asked the Minister of Health to please update the House on this government's support for survivors.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Survivors have exhibited great courage in overcoming daily challenges throughout their lives. I was very pleased on Friday to announce that the government will be providing survivors with tax-free payments every single year up to $100,000 for the rest of their lives to make sure that they are able to live in dignity. And in addition, Mr. Speaker, they will have access to an extraordinary medical assistance fund. We're very pleased to be able to support the survivors, but in particular, I'd like to thank Mercedes Benegmi, who is the head of the Thalidomide Survivors Association of Canada, for working so closely with me and with this entire House and with the government. And I want to congratulate her on a great victory.
The honourable member for Thunder Bay Superior North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On May 14th, this government tabled Via Rail's troubling annual report. Ridership and on-time performance are down. Costs and losses are up. But there may be hope, Mr. Speaker. Via is off track, but Amtrak is on track. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 unfilled positions on the Via board. Will the Minister of Transport consider appointing former Amtrak President and Cape Breton resident David Gunn to our Via board? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and of course I'll let the Minister make the appropriate appointments in due course. But the member will know that Via Rail is an independent arm's-length Crown corporation responsible for its operational decisions. Its primary objective is to provide safe and efficient passenger service. In keeping with this, Via is responsible for providing services in as cost-effective a manner as possible. They must work, Mr. Speaker, to ensure they're not a burden to taxpayers.
The honourable member for Bar-Richelieu, Nicolas Bécancourt. Mr. Speaker, people applying for permanent residency on humanitarian and compassionate grounds have until June 1st. That date was jointly set by the Quebec government and the federal government, but only 20% of people concerned have been able to take advantage. That's why Quebec City has called for an extension to the deadline, but the federal government hasn't budged. Once again, the federal neglect for humanitarian cases is jeopardizing thousands of Haitian families who have settled in Quebec. Will the government agree to Quebec's suggestion to extend the deadline to August 31st, or are they going to play the cold, callous bureaucrat?
Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, far from being bureaucratic or cold, Canada has the most generous immigration system in the world. That is why we've made it possible for Haitians to remain in Canada without even being permanent residents for years following the earthquake and for years following the political unrest in Haiti. Everyone affected by these measures is aware of their option to apply for permanent residency. We've encouraged them. Over 1,000 applications have been made, and the members' numbers are completely wrong. Very many Haitians have taken advantage of this opportunity to become permanent residents. The honourable member for Bar-Richelieu. Mr. Speaker, this morning, the main players in Quebec's agri-food industry, accompanied by the Quebec Agriculture Minister, have called on the federal government in connection with the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. They're concerned about pressure being brought to bear by Canada's trading partners over supply management. This program ensures fair revenue for our dairy, egg, and poultry producers, which account for about 92,000 jobs in Quebec. Will the Prime Minister commit to not sell out our supply-managed markets and reject all concessions for those industries, like the block motion stipulated, which was unanimously passed here in this House? The Honourable Minister of State. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to tell my colleague that we will continue to defend the interests of all industries in Canada, including agriculture, in connection with the negotiations of this free trade agreement. And I'd like to reassure my colleague that our government's record is promising for the future because we've signed free trade agreements with the European Union and South Korea while protecting supply management and agriculture. Mr. Speaker, as always, our government will sign a free trade agreement when it's advantageous for all Canadians. The Honourable Member for Hunsik. Mr. Speaker, this winter, highly qualified Canadian pilots were unemployed due to fewer oil and mining-related flights. Meanwhile, companies like Sunwing hired over 100 foreign pilots, ignoring the pool of available Canadian pilots. Why hasn't the Immigration Minister notified companies like Sunwing that they must always give hiring priority to qualified Canadian pilots? The Honourable Minister of Employment. Mr. Speaker, before hiring temporary foreign workers, Canadian companies have to attempt to fill vacant positions with available Canadian qualified workers. They have to make an effort to ascertain whether there are Canadians available to do the work. We have taken steps to severely penalize those who don't comply. It's a policy to ensure that Canadians are given hiring priority for Canadian jobs, and any company that doesn't comply will be punished. Thank you.
Members, the presence in the gallery of His Excellency Galu Sayakayan, President of the National Assembly of the Republic of Armenia. Tabling of documents. Depot the document. The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and pursuant to Standing Order 32.2, I have the honour to table in both official languages the treaties entitled Modifications to Canada's Government Procurement Market Access Schedule in the Revised Agreement on Government Procurement pursuant to Article 19 of that agreement done at Geneva on March 30th, 2012. Modifications to Canada's Government Procurement Market Access Schedule in the North American Free Trade Agreement pursuant to Article 1022 of that agreement done at Ottawa on December 11th and 17th, 1992, at Mexico on December 14th and 17th, 1992, and at Washington on December 8th and 17th, 1992. Modifications to Canada's Government Procurement Market Access Schedule in the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement pursuant to Article KBIS 14 of that agreement done at Santiago on December 5th, 1996. Modifications to Canada's Government Procurement Market Access Schedule in the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement pursuant to Article 13